Welcome to The Explainer. So today we are tackling something huge. We're diving into Simone de Beauvoir's monumental 1949 philosophical masterwork, The Second Sex. Whether you're already a huge fan of existential philosophy, or honestly just curious about how our modern societal roles got put together in the first place, we're going to break down her massive 2-volume text into clear, bite-sized concepts. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's start exactly where Beauvoir does, with the deceptively simple question: what is a woman? Beauvoir observes that, historically, humanity treats the masculine as both the positive and the neutral. It's kind of seen as the absolute default standard of being human. The feminine, on the other hand, well, it's defined solely in opposition to the masculine. It's basically characterized as a negative, a limitation, or a lack.
And that brings us to her legendary thesis: one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. This single sentence was absolutely revolutionary back in 1949. It totally captures her core existentialist belief, which is that existence precedes essence, meaning human identity isn't biologically predestined or fixed the moment you're born. Instead, what we call womanhood is actually a role constructed over time by history, society, and psychology.
All right, Section 1, what is a woman? The existentialist framework.
So, this idea perfectly illustrates the absolute core division of her entire philosophy: transcendence versus immanence. Beauvoir argues that historically men have systematically claimed transcendence for themselves. Transcendence is the active creation of the future, right? It's inventing, leading, and freely defining your own identity as a subject. Meanwhile, women have been relegated to immanence. Think of immanence as a static state. It's being confined to repetitive, maintenance-based tasks, where the individual isn't treated as a creator, but rather as an object or just a biological vessel.
Drawing on the philosopher Hegel's idea that humans define themselves by dominating others, the whole master-slave dialectic, she defines woman as the other. See, the subject defines itself by opposing everything else as the other. But Beauvoir points out that the subjugation of women is historically unique. Unlike other oppressed groups, women don't have a distinct historical origin point of defeat, and there's no separate shared community or territory. Instead, they live dispersed among men, bound directly to their oppressors by biological, emotional, and economic ties.
Moving to Section 2, Biology, Psychology, and Economics. Dismantling the justifications.
What's really fascinating here is how impartially Beauvoir methodically dismantles these so-called objective justifications. Let's take biology. She completely acknowledges that the female body's reproductive burden is real and taxing. But, she argues, a biological fact does not equal a moral destiny, especially in a modern world where physical strength isn't the only measure of human value. Then she tackles psychoanalysis. Freud's whole penis envy concept? Actually, she says it's not about the physical organ at all. What a young girl covets is the social power, prestige, and freedom that society automatically hands to boys. Finally, she looks at Marxist economics. Engels linked women's subjugation to the invention of private property, but Beauvoir says that's just too reductionist. It utterly fails to explain the deeper psychological roots of why men felt this need to possess women in the first place.
Okay, Section 3, History and Patriarchal Myth, the Trap of the Past.
Beauvoir traces this historic defeat of women chronologically, all the way back to prehistory. In early nomadic societies, men highly valued the transcendence of risking life in battle over the immanence of merely giving life, which kind of just tied women to nature. Then, with the agricultural age, property needed heirs, which effectively turned women into property themselves. By antiquity, women were legally non-entities, completely confined to the home. The Middle Ages introduced this conflicting religious paradox of Eve versus Mary, and by the modern era, documents like the 1804 Napoleonic Code codified absolute legal subordination right as the Industrial Revolution started exploiting their economic labor.
So to psychologically justify this ongoing historical trap, patriarchal society had to invent an abstract myth, and they called it the eternal feminine. This is a monolithic and frankly totally contradictory cultural idea. It depicts woman as both pure and corrupt, the life-giving muse and the death-bringing siren. Why create this myth? Well, Beauvoir argues it allows men to project their own existential fears and desires onto women, rather than having to actually look at them and recognize them as complex, equal human beings.
She actually proves this by analyzing the work of 5 prominent male authors. 4 of them reduce women to these instrumentalized tropes, whether it's viewing them with hostility as a threat to male genius or romanticizing them as irrational muses. They completely strip women of conscious agency. But Stendhal? He earns her praise. Why?
because he portrays women as actual human individuals, struggling authentically against the social oppression of their time.
Section 4. Becoming the Second Sex. Lived Experience.
So the real question is, how does a woman actively become this object in her daily life? Beauvoir maps out the formative years as a literal funneling of existential freedom. Step 1. Childhood. Boys are encouraged toward action, while girls are given dolls and taught passivity. They basically learn their value is in what they are, not what they do. In Step 2, puberty, the girl experiences her changing body not as power, but as a betrayal. She becomes an object of male desire while her own social horizons shrink down to just finding a husband. And finally, Step 3, sexual initiation, is fraught with psychological hurdles, caught between the asymmetry of male conquest and the deep social anxiety of female submission.
And then in adulthood, all this conditioning kind of locks into place with traditional marriage. For the husband, marriage is an addition. He keeps his career, his public life, his transcendence. But for the traditional wife, marriage is her entire career. She abandons her independent projects and is relegated to the domestic sphere. Beauvoir famously compares housework to the myth of Sisyphus, rolling that boulder up the hill every single day. It's an endless, unproductive loop of cleaning and maintaining that battles decay but creates no new value, trapping her completely in immanence. It's pretty wild to think about how much of this domestic dynamic is still hotly debated today.
Now, when you deny human beings true freedom, well, they've got to cope somehow, right? Beauvoir outlines 4 mechanisms of bad faith, ways women pretend to be free within their bondage. First, the mother. Beauvoir actually argues there is no biological maternal instinct and strongly warns against mothers living vicariously through their children. Then there's the narcissist who turns inward, making her own body an idol to worship. The woman in love tries to merge her identity entirely with a mortal man, setting him up as a god, which, spoiler alert, always fails. And the mystic directs that same passive passion toward a divine authority. The core problem here? None of these actually change your material reality. They just make the cage a little bit more comfortable.
Finally, Section 5. Towards genuine liberation. The path forward.
Okay, so she's diagnosed the problem. What's the cure? She insists that psychological freedom means absolutely nothing without material baselines. You just can't think your way out of economic dependence. So she outlines 3 massive structural pillars necessary to dismantle patriarchy. First, complete economic integration. We're talking equal pay and unhindered access to all professions. Second, collective childcare. Society as a whole has to step up and share the burden of raising the next generation. And third, reproductive freedom. Unrestricted access to contraception and safe abortion so that motherhood becomes a freely chosen project, not a forced biological duty.
But she does issue a warning here, and honestly, it's incredibly relevant today. Even the modern, economically independent woman faces a grueling inner conflict. She essentially carries a double burden. She's forced to balance the fierce professional competition of a masculine public world with the exhausting private pressure to remain traditionally feminine, attractive, and domestically capable. Economic independence is the foundation, for sure, but it's not the entire house.
So how do we finally fix it? She proposes one absolute, singular goal: the mutual recognition of freedom. This requires identical socialization for boys and girls right from birth. If both are raised to see each other as equals, truly recognizing the other as a free, transcending subject, that ancient master-slave dynamic can be completely replaced by genuine human brotherhood.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought from Beauvoir's masterwork. If liberating women also frees men from the alienating, anxious pressure of having to constantly act as masters and providers, what incredible human projects await us when we finally meet as true equals?
Please like and subscribe.